While a lot of its stories are from Mark, the Gospel of Matthew has some of the most memorable stories in the Bible, or rather, its version of those stories in Mark are the most memorable. Case in point, the story of Jesus walking on water. It's a story that appears in 3 out of the 4 Gospels. In John and Mark, Jesus simply appears, then gets into the boat. But in Matthew's version, it's a little different. Here, Peter has a conversation with Jesus, which leads to Peter nearly drowning, to which Jesus tells him, "Where is your faith?" This version of the story is the one depicted most in film and art. The Gospel of Matthew is arguably the most popular gospel. Not that the others aren't well known though. There's a surprising number of people today who believe Matthew was the first gospel written and not Mark. Maybe perhaps because it's claimed to have been written by Matthew, who's one of the 12. Why do people think Matthew the tax collector wrote this gospel? Well, I don't know for sure. Perhaps it's because in the Gospel of Matthew, unlike in Mark, the tax collector who gets called to follow Jesus is called Matthew instead of Levi. That's one of the little things in Matthew that's different from Mark. If this gospel was in fact written by a close follower of Jesus, it would have a more authoritative language. Nowhere does the author use the first-person perspective, especially in the story where Jesus calls Matthew to follow him. He doesn't say, well, one day Jesus came to me and said, follow me, and so I dropped everything and followed him. The author, if it's Matthew, is also absent in many of the stories he narrates. The way some of the stories are also written suggests that it was being written by someone outside of the actual events and time period, kind of like a screenwriter writing a TV show. Since we know Matthew copied Mark, let's take a look at a few stories in Mark that Matthew changes. Also, for simplicity, I'll just call the author Matthew even if I don't think Matthew the tax collector wrote it. I already mentioned the walking on water story, but there's also the confession of Peter found in Mark 8 and Matthew 16. In Mark 8, Jesus reveals his identity formally after Peter gets it right and tells him to keep their mouth shut. In Matthew, when Peter gets it right, Jesus tells him, "Blessed are you, Simon son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Matthew's version of the temptation in the desert is also the version seen the most in film. Mark doesn't have the 3 temptations. Matthew and Luke have them, but in Luke, the second and third from Matthew are switched in order. The last temptation of Jesus in Luke is for him to jump from the pinnacle of the temple. In Matthew, that's the second, and that's the order we see in films the most. There are many stories in Matthew that don't appear in Mark, but they do appear in Luke. Sometimes they are nearly identical. You might think that this implies Luke copied Matthew, but the common consensus is that perhaps Matthew and Luke had a source different from Mark. This hypothetical source is called quella or Q, which means source. This might sound insane for some, suggesting a hypothetical document or collection that we have no concrete evidence for. However, when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Matthew and Luke have stories in common that they didn't get from Mark, a source they both drew from. So how do Matthew and Luke have the same stories if they didn't get it from Mark? These common stories are oftentimes nearly but not exactly identical. An example of this is the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7 and the Sermon on the Plains in Luke 6, which both include the Beatitudes, the Golden Rule, the Lord's Prayer. A few more include the parable of the wedding feast in Matthew 22 and Luke 14, the parable of the yeast in Matthew 13 and Luke 13. A big change by Matthew from Mark is the resurrection narrative. The passion to burial story in both Gospels are very similar, sometimes even word for word, but where it greatly differs is in the resurrection. Now we all know Mark's puzzling ending where the women run off terrified and Jesus doesn't even get to appear in the final scene. Well, Matthew did what we all might do and add a better ending, one where Jesus actually appears and commissions his disciples to spread the word of God. Now remember what I keep saying, Matthew and Mark do not have the same theological agenda. Matthew doesn't care for Mark's misunderstood Jesus character who always gets disobeyed. One interesting change is that in Mark, the angel is described as a mere young man, while in Matthew the angel descends from heaven and this being is described as being like lightning with clothes as white as snow. Perhaps this little change meant to convey the author's attempt to cement Jesus' status and importance as an emissary of God. The biggest difference though, I would say, between Mark and Matthew is that Mark starts off with the baptism. This is kind of Mark's way of introducing to us who Jesus is by, declaring the Christological confession, "This is my beloved son." For Matthew, however, he has a birth narrative, and this is meant to convey the idea that Jesus was already the anointed one from his birth. The Gospel of Matthew doesn't actually start off with a birth narrative, rather with a long genealogy. Now, we have to ask ourselves, how does this author, writing more than 40 years after the death of Jesus, is able to trace Jesus back to Abraham? Well, there's no answer to that really. The better question to ask, however, is why? Why would Matthew write a long genealogy tracing Jesus to Abraham? I mean, isn't that pointless since the Israelites and consequently Jews are all children of Abraham? What's interesting though is that the author somehow manages to trace Jesus' genealogy through the exile, an event that basically made the Jews forget who they were back then, or at least it was meant to do so. The author of Matthew makes his intentions very clear in the first chapter, and these intentions become even more emphasized as the gospel goes on, and that is, Jesus is a Jew. Most people call the Gospel of Matthew the most Jewish gospel, which makes it rather ironic that people say Matthew, the tax collector, someone who we might assume was irreligious, an irreligious sinner, was the one who wrote it. Despite descending from the tribe of Judah, I mean, if he descended from anyone else, I don't think he'd be in Judea or Galilee, but nonetheless, despite this, Jesus is actually written as a kind of new Moses rather than a new David, which is what one might expect from a messianic figure. This is made clear in chapter 2 when the evil King Herod orders for the slaughter of the innocents, clearly a parallel to the story of the birth of Moses. Matthew views this as a fulfillment of prophecy, quoting Hosea, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." This is a very common thing you'll find in Matthew. An event occurs and he views it as a fulfillment of prophecy. Even the family's return from Egypt is somehow from a prophecy, though I'm not quite sure where it's from though. Matthew 2:23 says, "He will be called a Nazarene." I will say though, Matthew has a different view of what it means to fulfill prophecy or a verse in the Old Testament. Some of the so-called prophecies in Matthew from the Old Testament are actually intended to be prophecies. Some of them are just narration of events or figurative speech referring to something or someone else, usually David or Israel. In the case of Hosea's "Out of Egypt I have called my son." What Matthew means when something has been fulfilled is that they mean what they mean in their respective context, but they also, in a way, foreshadow or point to Jesus. So there's this sense of dual meaning. It's from the word itself, fulfilled. The Old Testament has been given more meaning than what we once thought. That's Matthew's belief when it comes to these so-called prophecies. The idea that Jesus is a new Moses is best seen in the Sermon on the Mountain, found in chapters 5-7. I will say, however, that the Beatitudes and many of the teachings in the sermon are likely to be in Q, since you can find them as well in Luke's Sermon on the Plains. In Matthew's sermon, Jesus emphasizes piety to the law, which may be in stark contrast to either Paul's teachings or that of modern-day Christianity. Instead of having a more liberal view of the Jewish law, Jesus hammers it down, even doubling down on it. "You have heard it said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished." Now, the Pharisees in the Gospels may be seen as the religious, legalistic, mustache-twirling villains, but in Jesus' sermon he says, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." In chapter 23, before Jesus gets into an angry rant about them, he says, "The scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach." So for Matthew, the Pharisees are some sort of standard for religiousness and how to live a good life, despite the fact that today the word Pharisee is often synonymized with hypocrisy or a hypocrite. Going back to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus here doubles down on the law. Instead of saying the old law is no more, here's the new, he says, "Do not murder, but I say to you, do not get angry. Anyone who wants to get a divorce must get a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, do not divorce." Right? Jesus never negates the Jewish law in any way in Matthew. Now, he may have disagreements with the Pharisees when it comes to interpretation of said law, but for Jesus, his message is the original and true meaning of the law, not some kind of new coat of paint on the law. It's no different to Christians today, for example, who argue about their own beliefs, about which one is true. You know, a lot of them, all Christians, fact of the matter, claim that their beliefs are the authentic originals. With all that said, I have to wonder, would the Jesus of Matthew clash with that of Paul? When I was a Christian, I was actually heavily conflicted by this. I was reading Matthew and I got the impression that one needs to be a pious Jew to enter the kingdom of God, and it made me wonder, would the author of Matthew want new converts who would join his community to be circumcised? It might seem uncomfortable to some to suggest that these books, in the same collection of books we call the Holy Bible, would contradict one another in any way, but we must assess them as individual works with their own message. That being said, who is the author of Matthew? A Jew, perhaps? A Jewish Christian? Christianity was, after all, a sect of Judaism once, and while eventually Gentile converts outnumbered Jewish converts, most of the early followers of Jesus and the early church, for that matter, were Jews. Let's not forget this. If it's a Jew writing, and I don't know or believe that's the case, where was this text written? Well, no one knows. Some people think they do. They look at places where there's a large concentration of Jews and Christians in one area, but that could be literally anywhere. I mean, Antioch, Syria, Judea, it's hard to know. Now, I just said the Gospel of Matthew is the most Jewish gospel, yet it contains some stories and sayings which we today might perceive to be anti-Semitic. So what's the deal with that? If Jesus is portrayed again and again as the new Moses, and the law being as important as it is, what's the deal with the patterns of anti-Jewishness here? We all obviously know of the passage that's exclusive to Matthew's passion narrative, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." But there are other examples that people point to as signs of Christian anti-Semitism, such as the condemnation against the Pharisees in the temple. I won't go into too much detail as I have made a video already on Christian anti-Semitism, but to put it short, the discourses and situations in Matthew represent the conflict of the early church, many of whom were Jews, and the Jews who did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. It's a classic case of Jews against Jews, something we see in the Old Testament quite frequently. I'm not saying the author or all of his community were Jews specifically, but that the conflict represents the fractures of Judaism and Christianity, which used to be one. The existence of a law implies someone is doing the opposite of what the law says. When someone preaches something, they likely preach against something as well. For example, the author of Timothy is adamant that women should not hold church gatherings or have such a prominent role. Why was this written? Well, perhaps because the author of Timothy was aware that there were in fact churches doing exactly that. In fact, we kind of have evidence for this when Paul greets Junia in one of his letters, calling her foremost among the apostles. Another example, Jesus says, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law." Who in Jesus' time was thinking that? Judging by how Jesus acts in the gospel, it seems unreasonable to think that one would. However, by the time Matthew was writing, other versions of Christianity, like Pauline Christianity, certainly held such views that the old law is no more. Matthew directly rebuts this kind of view, so it's a sort of commentary in some way with regards to that. This is a good way to understand the historical and socio-political context of the time, by trying to understand why would Matthew write this in. Secondly, why does Matthew target the Pharisees? Well, people today say that you hate what you love. In other words, you're critical of the things you care about. And this is pretty much the same as that. Matthew targets the Pharisees specifically because in the post-Second Temple period, the Pharisees were the influential ones, the religious leaders of the scattered Jews. There were no more Sadducees after all. This explains why they have such a big role in the Gospels. This is a classic case in the Bible of Israel being divided, or in this case, Jews arguing with other Jews about true Judaism. In chapter 23, where Jesus gets into an angry rant about the Pharisees, he actually says beforehand to listen to the Pharisees and their interpretation of the law, but to not be like them. Now, the last thing I'll touch upon is the irony regarding the Gentiles and Jews. In chapter 15, a Gentile or a Canaanite woman proclaims Jesus is the son of David and displays her faith. Now think about it, why would a Gentile of all people proclaim Jesus as the son of David? That's a Christological claim. No one, especially a Gentile during the time of Jesus when he was alive, would profess such things. In the same way, no one from the far, far east would wander to Jerusalem and ask, "Where do we worship the King of the Jews?" In the same way, no Roman would stand by the cross of a convicted criminal and say, "Truly this was the Son of God." These stories, more than likely, display how Gentiles are the ones who later joined the church, and that the Christian message was rejected by the Jews, who were themselves the original target audience. One detail you may have noticed is that Jesus says again and again that he was only sent to the Jews. He says this to the Canaanite woman. When he sends out the 12, he tells them to only go to the lost sheep of Israel. But after the resurrection, Jesus seemingly changes his mind and tells the disciples to go to the nations and proclaim the good news. What changed? Well, apart from these random Gentiles somehow figuring out who Jesus is, Jesus got executed by order of the Jews. And so to Matthew, Jesus' death is a transgression that falls on the heads of the Jews who did not believe in Jesus. And that is an incomplete analysis of the Gospel of Matthew. Thanks for watching. But wait a minute. In Matthew, Okay, in Matthew, Jesus never proclaims himself as the Messiah. And come to think about it, nowhere in Matthew or Mark is it clear that you have to believe in Jesus in order to be saved. Sure, it's present in John, and sure, Paul says it a lot, but Matthew and Mark sure as hell do not have it as the central message, even though these authors almost certainly believed Jesus was some sort of divine savior. In fact, we find the parable of the sheep and goats in Matthew specifically, where Jesus says that those who have done good to others have done the same to him and thus are saved. So what's going on here?